Beth opened her eyes, her neck and paw throbbing once again. This, however, was a different kind of pain. It was aching, and there was a heavy weight on her. She tried to adjust her head only for the pain in her neck to increase tenfold. She was still in her wolf form. She knew because of the heightened senses. The feeling was sublime. Beth felt at peace. Her mind was still a little foggy from what happened, and she tried to move away from the pile of fur she was under. Trying her best, Beth tried to move, not making any sudden movements. She was already in a lot of pain, and she didn't want to add to it. Before Beth had moved no more than an inch, she heard a growl, and the weight over her adjusted. It was a wolf. The same wolf that had saved her from the attack, the wolf who was her mate. Whimpering, she tried to move again, but to no avail. Her mate was deep asleep, covering her tiny frame with his humongous one. Giving up, Beth tried to focus on the smell around her to distract her mind. She wasn't bleeding, or at least she didn't think she was, but the pain was only getting worse by the second. She focused her mind on the smell of freshly brewed coffee, strawberries, and smoke. It was tranquil. As if on cue, her mind began to run at its own pace, conjuring mental pictures of her mate in his human body. Would he be well built? Would he be tall? Taller than her? He had to be, considering his wolf was twice her size. She thought to herself. Which pack was he from? Or was he a rogue? Her mind was abuzz with millions of questions, and the warmth that the fur of her mate provided didn't help at all. It was firing up neurons in her brain at millions per second, and she wasn't sure what to do. Unknowingly, she pictured her mate and herself in their human body. She didn't know what her mate looked like, but because he had black fur, he must have black hair, and he was probably tall and muscular. She conjured up the image and focused on the height differences between them and the flaws on her face when she felt her body shift. To shift back to the human form, one must conjure up a mental image of one's human self. Beth remembered. She had also read this from an old book recording the history of werewolves, which her father kept hidden in his library. But there was another nagging voice in the back of her mind, telling her not to, as if the danger hadn't completely subsided, which in fact, it hadn't. Beth realized the dilemma she was in. She was in her wolf form and injured. She also had no idea where she was or on whose territory. It was a safer option to stay in her wolf form, for whatever she was in. If she was in any of the northern territories, as long as she was in her wolf, no one would be able to recognize her for who she indeed was. Thus, she would not have to return to her family. If she, hopefully not, for she had heard too many rumors of their barbaric ways, was in the Wilson Pack territory, it was safer to stay in her wolf form, for the whole pack was always in their wolf form. There also was the inclination that her mate had yet to shift into his human form, and no wolf, no matter how strong, would want to keep to their wolf form after finding their mate. Unwittingly, she dispersed all the images of her human self from her mind and decided to stay in her wolf form until she was sure where she was. Shifting her body, she made herself comfortable, as much as she could, for this was the first time she turned into her wolf. As euphoric as the animal in her was, all she wanted deep down was to turn to her human self and stretch her legs. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't realize that her mate, whose name she had yet to learn, was now awake and looking at her with a keen eye. His gaze was intense, and it looked as if he could see inside her soul just by looking at her, and as if he could find out all of her secrets. It was odd, the sensation. The eyes of her mate's wolf on her wolf. But he wasn't looking at her, rather, at her wounds. The one on her neck and on her leg. Howling, her mate moved closer. Not being accustomed to his wolf's language yet, she mimicked his actions and got up on her paws, only for him to nudge her shoulder rather harshly until she lay on the ground in a very uncomfortable position. Not being able to hold her paws in the air for much longer, Beth rolled to the left side when her mate circled around her and poked her with his nose. Whimpering a little, Beth rolled over to her right side until the wound on her neck was exposed to him. Maybe he just wanted to examine it? She thought to herself. His wolf began to lick away at her wound, which was probably covered in blood. They were in their wolf form, and wolves were primal animals that feed on other animals, which meant blood was not uncommon for them. But the way he was licking her neck gave her the idea that maybe he liked her blood. Beth hoped not, both for his sake and her sanity. Wolf or not, she would not be able to deal with a wolf who liked the taste of their own mate's blood. Once her mate was done cleaning, as Beth had begun to think of, for she wanted to think positive for the situation she was in, he began to move down to her leg. Humming to herself, she left him to do his thing, making a mental note to ask him later, when they turned into their human form. Once satisfied with his work, her mate nuzzled his head against her neck, keeping away from the wound by mere inches, and closed his eyes. It didn't take him long to sleep, but Beth found it impossible to sleep. The position they were in was very intimate for wolves. She had often seen older mates in her own pack, showing each other affection by the same gestures, such as during celebrations of new pups being born. Her mind was up and running. The pain was still there, and she had yet to test her legs' motor abilities, but all she could focus on at the moment was her mate's breath on her neck. It gave her goosebumps. Keeping her breath steady for her mate's sake, she stayed under the amber tree's shade the entire day, with her mate sleeping beside her. Thinking of her mother and her father. Her betrayal towards them. She closed her eyes, not wanting to overthink the hurt she had caused them. Beth opened her eyes, trying to make sense of her environment. Twice on the same day, she had fallen asleep in the middle of the woods. This time, however, it was dark. The only source of light was some illumination from the distance. Still, the light, or rather, lights were bright and high enough on the lampposts to provide both Beth and her wolf mate with some form of light in the dark and daunting woods. Her mate was still in his wolf form, which was now proving to be a red flag for Beth. The probability of him being from the Wilson pack and her being in their territory was increasing by the minute, and it made a cold shiver run down her spine, even in her wolf form. She looked at her mate and saw him with a stick in his jaw, tapping it on the ground. Not being able to contain her curiosity, Beth got up only to be pushed back by him. Scowling, she waited for him to finish. Once he was done, he moved away, and Beth sat up to see a very ugly-looking writing of "Stay here, I will be back" on the ground. She nodded her head to her mate, who was looking at her impatiently. Once sure that she would stay, he ran away. Beth stayed in the same spot, not knowing what else to do. She wanted to leave but she couldn't, because she didn't know where she was, and nor did she think her leg would allow her to walk a great distance. And then there was the uncertainty in the identity of her mate. She had yet to see who he was, and while she hadn't decided if she would stay with him forever, she also didn't want to go without knowing him. What if one day she wanted to come back and see him? Beth didn't think she was lucky enough to find her mate again in the middle of the woods or 2 times in her lifetime. Being at this one time was a miracle in itself, for it was utterly unheard of to stumble upon your mate in the woods, in unknown territory. Whimpering, she looked up at the sky. Through her wolf eyes, the stars above her looked even more beautiful than they did from her human eyes. There was a cluster of stars that seemed to be at the edge of the infinite universe. She began to see them as the reflection of the rebels within each pack, who wanted nothing more than to be able to break free from the chains of pressure. To Beth, in the cold night, the stars in the distance, yet all together in the galaxy, were a symbol of the rebellion she had bred. Just like the stars there, she realized that she too had people, or rather, that there were people like her in other packs, who, when given a chance, would run away from their homes, leaving the comfort and shelter of their families and rediscovering themselves like she was trying to. It was a great comfort, on a night such as that, alone. Content with knowing that she would be safe and was not alone, she began to count the stars to see how many people were out there like her. Deep down, Beth knew it was childish of her to do such a thing, but she had to because ever since her mate left her alone, she had been thinking about nothing but her family. How had her father treated her mother once he had found out that Beth was gone? Did Henry feel betrayed? Was her mother all right? And most of all, did she, Beth, do the right thing by running away? The guilt had been eating away at her, and in all honesty, she was scared.